Millionaire falls in love with a waitress on a blind date, and something surprising happens. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the journey. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the distant sizzle of bacon on the griddle. The morning rush had begun, and Alice Moretti moved swiftly between tables, balancing plates, dodging impatient customers, and avoiding the sharp gaze of her manager, Linda. The Maplewood Diner had been her life for the past 3 years, a place of endless orders and meager paychecks. She was good at her job, not because she loved it, but because she had no other choice. "Table 4 is still waiting on their pancakes," Linda barked from the counter, her voice as grating as nails on a chalkboard. "I'm on it," Alice muttered, wiping a stray strand of auburn hair from her forehead. A deep sigh escaped her lips as she grabbed the plate and made her way through the crowd. She had dreams once, big ones. As a child, she would spend hours sketching, creating art that made her feel alive. But dreams didn't pay bills. Her mother's hospital debts and a mountain of overdue rent had drowned any hope she had of making it as an artist. Her best friend, Camilla, leaned against the counter, watching her with a mischievous grin. "So, big news," Camilla started, her voice dripping with excitement. "Unless it's about someone miraculously paying off my rent, I don't want to hear it." Alice huffed, setting the plate down in front of a grumpy old man who barely grunted in response. Camilla slid a sleek black envelope across the counter. "It's better than rent money," she said. "I signed you up for an exclusive blind date." Alice blinked. "You did what?" "Relax. It's one of those high-end dating services, super elite, the kind of thing where billionaires meet models." Alice snorted. "Great, I'll be the poor charity case they laugh at." Camilla grinned wider. "Not if they don't know you're broke. Think about it. One night, fancy dinner, no obligations. Maybe you charm some rich guy into falling madly in love with you and funding your dream studio." Alice stared at the envelope. "And what makes you think someone like me even belongs in that world?" "Because you're gorgeous, smart, and, let's be honest, you could use a little fun," Camilla said, nudging the envelope closer. Alice hesitated, then grabbed it. "Fine, but if this turns into some pretty woman situation, I'm demanding a cut of the profits." Camilla winked. "Deal." Alice sighed, tucking the envelope into her apron. She had no idea that this one decision would change her life forever. Let us know where you're tuning in from. Leave a comment before we get started and enjoy the journey. Alice had never felt more out of place in her life. The moment she stepped into the grand lobby of the Astoria, one of New York's most exclusive restaurants, she knew she didn't belong. The walls were lined with gold accents, chandeliers dripped with crystals, and the sound of hushed conversations hummed in the background, each voice oozing wealth and refinement. She clutched the sides of her thrift store dress, trying not to fidget. Camilla had done her makeup, styled her hair, and forced her into a pair of heels that made walking feel like a near-death experience. The maitre d' barely looked at her before leading her through the restaurant. Her hands were clammy as she was guided toward an elegant table tucked near the window. And then she saw him, Ethan Duvall. He wasn't just handsome. He was devastatingly unfairly good-looking. Sharp cheekbones, chiseled jaw, piercing blue eyes that held the coldness of a man who had seen the world and found it disappointing. He sat with an air of effortless control, his perfectly tailored suit molding to his broad shoulders. Alice had expected a rich guy, maybe a little arrogant, but this was something else. Ethan glanced at his watch the second she sat down. "You're late," he said, his tone as smooth as silk but twice as sharp. Alice raised an eyebrow. "Wow, not even a hello? Guess manners weren't part of your billionaire upbringing." He tilted his head slightly, studying her as if she were an anomaly. "You must be Alice," he said finally, his voice unreadable. "And you must be Ethan," she shot back, flashing a saccharine smile. "Unless I got seated at the wrong table, in which case I'd love to meet whoever ordered." The lobster, a flicker of something, amusement, crossed his face before disappearing. "I didn't expect this." "What? A woman with a personality?" she quipped. "Tragic." The corner of his mouth twitched, but he didn't smile. Instead, he leaned back, his gaze unreadable. "I don't usually do blind dates." "Same here," Alice replied, reaching for the menu. But I figured free meal, expensive wine, why not? Ethan let out a slow exhale, as if trying to decipher whether she was joking. Their waiter appeared, offering an extensive wine list. Ethan didn't even glance at it. A bottle of Chateau Margaux, 2009. Alice raised an eyebrow. I was thinking of a beer. The waiter hesitated, clearly unsure of whether she was serious. Ethan, however, seemed fascinated. You'd rather have beer at one of the most prestigious restaurants in the country? I'd rather not drink something that costs more than my monthly rent, she shot back. This time, he smirked, just slightly, but enough for her to notice. The food arrived, impeccably plated, but Alice barely noticed. The conversation between them was an odd mix of tension and intrigue. Ethan was distant, calculated, his words measured. But Alice was no pushover. She challenged him, called him out on his cold demeanor, and threw sarcasm like daggers. By the time dessert arrived, the tension had shifted. There was something else now, something neither of them wanted to ignore. A pull, a quiet intensity lurking beneath their words. And then, just as Alice was about to say something reckless, Ethan's phone buzzed. His face darkened instantly. I have to go, he said abruptly, standing so quickly that his chair scraped against the floor. Alice blinked, caught off guard. Okay? Did I scare you off with my sparkling personality? He ignored the comment, pulling out his wallet and leaving a few $100 bills on the table. Enjoy the rest of your evening. And just like that, he was gone. Alice stared after him, a mix of irritation and curiosity brewing inside her. What the hell had just happened? Alice should have walked away from that night and never thought about Ethan Duval again. She should have chalked it up to a weird, slightly insulting experience and moved on with her life. After all, she wasn't the type to pine over some arrogant billionaire who clearly had more important things to do than finish a date. And yet, here she was, standing outside the towering glass headquarters of Duval Enterprises, gripping an envelope so tightly that the edges crumpled in her fingers. Camilla had spent the entire morning trying to talk her out of it. Alice, do you understand how rich people all work? Camilla had sighed, sitting on the edge of Alice's bed. They drop money the way we drop crumbs. He's not going to care that he paid for your dinner. That's not the point, Alice had shot back, pacing the tiny apartment. He left me sitting there like some afterthought. And then, this morning, his assistant sends me a contract? She shook the envelope. A freaking NDA, Camilla. He wants me to sign a non-disclosure agreement about a date that lasted 20 minutes. Okay, that's weird, Camilla admitted. But do you really want to march into his office and start a war with a guy who could probably buy this whole building just to kick you out of it? Alice had gritted her teeth. I just want to return this stupid contract and tell him exactly where he can shove it. Which led her to now, standing in the gleaming lobby of Duval Enterprises, feeling entirely out of place. The receptionist, a severe-looking woman with platinum blonde hair, gave Alice a once-over, her expression barely concealing her disapproval. Do you have an appointment? Alice plastered on her most charming smile. Not exactly, but if you let Mr. Duval know that the woman he rudely abandoned last night is here to return his contract, I think he'll make time. The woman's expression didn't change. Mr. Duval is in a meeting. Great, I'll wait. Alice plopped into one of the leather chairs near the floor-to-ceiling windows, crossing her legs. The receptionist pursed her lips, but didn't argue. 30 minutes passed. Then 45. Alice could feel the eyes of expensive suited executives passing through the lobby, their curiosity barely veiled. She was just about to give up when a voice broke through the silence. What the hell are you doing here? Alice turned, and there he was. Ethan Duval stood just outside the elevators, his sharp navy suit still perfect, but his expression was far from composed. He looked irritated, like she was the last person he expected or wanted to see. Alice stood, waving the envelope. Returning your precious contract. A muscle ticked in his jaw as he strode toward her, lowering his voice. This isn't the place for... She thrust the envelope into his chest. I don't need your hush money, and I don't appreciate being treated like some disposable nobody. Ethan exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around the envelope. You're making a scene. Good, she snapped. Maybe next time you'll think twice before walking out on someone like they don't matter. Something flickered in his eyes, something unreadable. For the first time, he didn't look just annoyed. He looked unsettled. Alice. "Enjoy your meeting, Mr. Duval," she interrupted, turning on her heel and walking straight out the door. She didn't look back. But if she had, she would have seen Ethan standing there, gripping the envelope, watching her go with an expression he couldn't quite explain. And for the first time in years, Ethan Duval felt something that genuinely unnerved him, intrigued. Before we embark on this story, write down where you're watching from in the comments. Let's go. Alice Moretti was done with Ethan Duval. Or at least, that's what she told herself as she tied the apron around her waist and prepared for another long shift at the Maplewood Diner. She had successfully given him a piece of her mind, shoved that ridiculous NDA back in his hands, and walked out of his world forever. So why was he still lingering in her thoughts? The way his blue eyes had darkened when she challenged him. The way his fingers had tightened around the envelope like he wasn't used to. Hearing the word no. The way, for just a second, he had looked at her not with arrogance, but with something else. Something almost like curiosity. She shook the thought away. It didn't matter. She had her own problems to deal with. Like the fact that her rent was due in 3 days and her paycheck wasn't going to cut it. And then, fate intervened. "Alice!" Camilla burst through the kitchen doors of the diner, nearly knocking over a tray of coffee cups. "You're not going to believe this." Alice sighed, wiping her hands on a towel. "If it's about another blind date, I'm going to throw this coffee pot at you." Camilla grinned, completely unfazed. "Better. You just got a one-night job that pays 3 times what you make in a week." Alice narrowed her eyes. "What's the catch?" "You have to work a charity gala as a server," Alice groaned. "I swear, if this is another elite social event, where I run into—" "Yep," Camilla interrupted, her eyes twinkling. "Ethan Duval will be there." Alice opened her mouth, closed it, then groaned louder. "No, absolutely not." Camilla clapped her hands together. "Come on, it's just one night. You'll be invisible, trust me. Just serve drinks, collect your paycheck, and go home. Invisible." Alice wasn't sure why the words stung, but she needed the money, and Ethan Duval was just another guest. She could handle this, right? The moment Alice stepped into the grand ballroom of the Whitmore Hotel, she regretted everything. The place was pure opulence. Golden chandeliers, walls lined with deep red velvet, and a sea of people dressed in designer suits and gowns that probably cost more than her entire apartment. She tightened her grip on the silver tray she was balancing, reminding herself she was here to work, not to gawk, not to think about Ethan Duval. But then, there he was, standing near the grand staircase, dressed in a sharp black tuxedo, his presence commanding without effort. He wasn't just wealthy, he belonged in this world, in a way that made Alice's stomach twist with something uncomfortably close to resentment. He was laughing at something a stunning brunette whispered in his ear. His date, no doubt. Alice clenched her jaw and turned away. She had a job to do. For the next hour, she floated through the ballroom, serving drinks and avoiding anything remotely close to Ethan's line of sight. She was almost in the clear, almost, when a deep, familiar voice stopped her in her tracks. "Alice?" She turned, tray still balanced in her hands, and met Ethan's piercing gaze. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, oh, those damn blue eyes, were sharp, questioning. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Alice straightened her back. "Working. Some of us don't have the luxury of just throwing money at problems and making them disappear." A flicker of something, guilt, crossed his face, but it was gone before she could be sure. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low. Alice let out a sharp laugh. "Right. Because it would be so embarrassing for the great Ethan Duval to be seen with a waitress, even in a professional capacity." Ethan's jaw tightened. "That's not what I meant." Before she could respond, a waiter passed by, and Alice, distracted, took a step back. And disaster struck. Her tray, wobbled. The glasses of champagne tipped, and in one horrifying second, a full glass of red wine went flying, straight onto the pristine white gown of Ethan's date. The room fell into stunned silence. Alice's stomach dropped. The woman gasped, staring at the stains spreading across the expensive fabric. "You absolute," the woman hissed, but Ethan cut her off. "It was an accident," he said firmly, his gaze locked on Alice. Alice swallowed hard. I can pay for the cleaning." "You can't afford it," the woman snapped. Alice's face burned. Ethan's expression darkened. "That's enough." His date turned on him, stunned. "Ethan, she just ruined—" "I said that's enough," he repeated, voice like steel. Alice wanted to disappear. Instead, she did the next best thing. She dropped the tray, turned, and bolted out of the ballroom. She barely made it into the hallway before she felt a hand wrap around her wrist. She spun around, breathless. "Ethan, you're leaving?" he asked. Alice yanked her arm free. "What else am I supposed to do? Apologize to your girlfriend while she calls security?" "She's not my girlfriend," Ethan said quietly. Alice hesitated, heart pounding. There was something in his voice, something different. Not arrogance, not amusement, something almost like regret. But before she could make sense of it, someone called his name from inside the ballroom. Ethan glanced toward the voice, then back at Alice. And for a split second, just a moment, he looked torn. But only for a moment. Then, his expression hardened, and he stepped back. "Go home, Alice." Alice clenched her fists, turned, and walked away. This time for good, or so she thought. Because she had no idea that this night was only the beginning. Alice should have gone home. She should have walked away from that gala, shaken off the humiliation and never looked back. But instead, she found herself wandering the quiet streets of Manhattan, her head spinning, not just from the wine-stained disaster, but from Ethan Duvall himself. She hated how he got under her skin, hated how he had looked at her, not with mockery, but with something that felt dangerously close to concern. And most of all, she hated the way her heart had pounded when he caught her wrist, like he wasn't quite ready to let her go. None of it made sense. A billionaire, like him, had no reason to care about someone like her, and yet, Alice. She froze. The voice was unmistakable, deep, steady, controlled. She turned slowly, and there he was. Ethan Duvall, standing under the glow of a street lamp, his tuxedo still perfect, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing here?" she asked, trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened. Ethan stepped closer, his hands tucked into his pockets. "You left in a hurry." Alice let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, well, I figured my job prospects at that gala were pretty much ruined the second I turned your date into a walking crime scene." "She wasn't my date," he corrected, his gaze never leaving hers. Alice swallowed. "Then what was she?" Ethan hesitated. For the first time since she'd met him, he seemed unsure. "It doesn't matter," he finally said. "I wanted to make sure you were okay." Alice blinked. "You... what?" Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I shouldn't have let you leave like that." Something about the way he said it, low, almost regretful, sent a shiver down Alice's spine. She crossed her arms, trying to steady herself. "Why do you care, Ethan? Last night you couldn't leave our date fast enough. Then today, you act like you don't want me at the gala. Now you're following me through the city?" She shook her head. "I don't get it." Ethan was silent for a moment. Then, finally, he spoke. "I don't get it either," he admitted. Alice's breath hitched. It was the honesty in his voice that threw her off. The way he looked at her, like he was just as confused by this strange pull between them as she was. She should have walked away. Instead, she said, "Well, since you ruined my night, you owe me a drink." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You want a drink? Unless you have a better idea." For the first time since she'd met him, Ethan Duvall smiled. A real, genuine smile. And it completely wrecked her. "Come on," he said. They ended up in a quiet little bar on the Lower East Side, far from the glitz and glamour of his world. Alice ordered a whiskey. Ethan, to her surprise, ordered the same. "You drink whiskey?" she asked, smirking. Ethan took a slow sip. "You sound surprised. I figured you were more of a..." She gestured vaguely. "Fancy wine. expensive scotch kind of guy. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Maybe you don't know me as well as you think. Alice tilted her head. Then tell me, who is Ethan Duval? His smile faded, just slightly. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, a man who has spent his entire life being told who he's supposed to be. Alice frowned. And who is that? Ethan's gaze darkened. A Duval. It was an answer, and yet, it wasn't. Alice could hear the weight in his voice, the unspoken pressure that came with being born into privilege. She didn't pity him. He had more money than he'd ever need. But for the first time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, Ethan Duval wasn't as in control of his life as he wanted the world to believe, and she wasn't sure why that realization made her heart ache. The night stretched on, filled with stolen glances, quiet confessions, and attention that neither of them dared to name. By the time they left the bar, the city was bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. Ethan walked beside her, his presence steady, solid. Alice had never felt more off balance. As they reached the corner where they would part ways, she turned to him, hesitating. This was unexpected, she admitted. Ethan nodded. Yes, it was. Silence. Then, I should go, Alice said, though she wasn't sure. She really wanted to. Ethan's gaze lingered on her for just a second too long. Then he nodded. Good night, Alice. She swallowed, turned, and walked away. But as she disappeared into the night, one thought haunted her. She wasn't done with Ethan Duval. Not even close. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the journey. Alice woke up the next morning with a headache. Not from alcohol, but from the lingering weight of the night before. She had spent hours with Ethan Duval, talking, arguing, laughing, and, worse, she had liked it. That was the part that scared her the most. Ethan wasn't the kind of man she could afford to get close to. He belonged to a world of billion-dollar deals, private jets, and cold calculations. She belonged to a world of late rent notices, double shifts, and cheap whiskey. Whatever had happened between them last night, it was a fluke, a mistake, and she was determined to forget about it. But Ethan Duval wasn't a man who let things go. She was halfway through her shift at the Maplewood Diner when the bell above the door chimed. Alice didn't bother looking up at first. She was too busy pouring coffee into an old man's cup, nodding along as he mumbled about how things were better in the 60s. Then she heard it, a low, clipped voice. Alice Moretti. She froze. Slowly she turned, and there he was. Ethan stood in the doorway of the tiny, greasy diner like he had just stepped out of another world. His crisp gray suit, his sharp blue eyes, the controlled expression that masked whatever he was really thinking. He did not belong here, and yet, here he was. Alice's heart slammed against her ribs. What are you doing here? Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, pulled out a sleek black folder, and placed it on the counter between them. Alice stared at it like it might bite. What is that? Ethan's voice was impossibly steady. A contract. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. Are you serious? Completely. Alice crossed her arms. Let me guess. Another NDA? Or is this a restraining order? Ethan exhaled slowly, like he was trying to find patience he didn't have. It's an agreement, one that benefits both of us. She narrowed her eyes. Keep talking. He flipped the folder open. It's simple. You agree to spend time with me, publicly. Attend a few events. Play the part. Alice blinked. Play the part of what? Ethan met her gaze. My fiancé. The diner went silent. The old man at the counter stopped stirring his coffee. Camilla, who had been wiping down a table nearby, audibly gasped. Alice felt like the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. What? Ethan, ever composed, continued. I need to appear settled. My grandfather is pushing for an engagement. If I don't choose someone, he will. Alice stared at him like he had lost his mind. And you think I'm the solution to that problem? You're unexpected, Ethan said simply. No one will question it because no one will see it coming. Alice let out a disbelieving laugh. You're insane. Ethan closed the folder. It would be strictly business. A few months, and then we part ways. Compensation included, of course. There it was. Alice stiffened. "You're trying to buy me." Ethan hesitated. "It's not." "Go to hell, Ethan." She grabbed the contract, tore it in half, and threw the pieces onto the counter. Ethan didn't flinch. He just studied her, his expression unreadable. Alice's hands were shaking. She didn't know if it was from anger or something worse. Something dangerously close to disappointment. "You think everything can be solved with money," she whispered. Ethan's jaw tightened. Alice took a step back, shaking her head. "Get out of my diner." For the first time since she met him, Ethan Duvall looked uncertain. Like this wasn't the reaction he had expected. But after a long pause, he nodded. Then he turned and walked out the door. Alice stood there, breathing hard, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had just thrown away what was probably the easiest paycheck of her life. So why did it feel like she, had lost something much bigger? Ethan Duvall did not get rejected, at least not by people who knew what was good for them. Yet here he was, standing in the dimly lit study of his penthouse apartment, replaying the moment Alice Moretti had looked him in the eye, torn his contract in half, and told him to go to hell. He should have been furious. Instead, he was intrigued. She said no? Ethan's grandfather, Charles Duvall, sat across from him, his expression one of measured disapproval. The man had spent his entire life controlling the empire Ethan was now expected to inherit, and he had little patience for unpredictability. Ethan swirled the amber liquid in his glass. She said no. Charles exhaled through his nose. "And you let her?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "I don't force people into agreements, grandfather." A thin smile curled on the older man's lips. "That's where we differ." Ethan clenched his teeth. He had spent his entire life under Charles's control, groomed to be the perfect heir, the perfect businessman, the perfect Duvall. He had followed every expectation, met every demand, but lately he was starting to wonder if he had ever made a single decision for himself. "This woman," Charles continued, tapping his fingers against the mahogany desk. "You believe she was the right choice?" Ethan hesitated. "She was unexpected." "That's not an answer." Ethan leaned forward. "She doesn't care about money. She doesn't care about the Duvall name. That makes her more convincing than any socialite you could throw at me." Charles studied him for a long moment. Then, with a slow nod, he said, "Find another way to get her to agree." Ethan exhaled sharply. "If I push too hard, she'll never agree." Charles smirked. "Then make her come to you." Ethan frowned. "And how do you suggest I do that?" Charles leaned back, in his chair, eyes gleaming. "Give her something to lose." Alice spent the next few days trying to pretend that Ethan Duvall didn't exist. She picked up extra shifts, kept her head down, and ignored the lingering feeling that she had walked away from something she didn't quite understand. But Ethan Duvall wasn't done with her. She found out when her landlord slipped a letter under her door. Final notice. Alice's stomach dropped. She had been scraping by for months, but this was a death sentence. If she didn't come up with the money in the next 2 weeks, she'd be out. Homeless. Her mind raced. She could pick up more shifts. She could ask Camilla for help. A sharp knock on the door made her jump. She opened it, and there he was. Ethan Duvall, standing in the dimly lit hallway of her apartment building like a wolf who had finally found his prey. Alice's pulse kicked up. "What are you doing here?" Ethan held up a piece of paper. She recognized it immediately. Her eviction notice. Her breath caught. "How did you—" "I have my ways," he said smoothly. "I told you, Alice. I don't like being told no." Her hands curled into fists. "If you think you can just—" I'm here to gloat," he interrupted. "I'm here to make you another offer." Alice glared at him. "I don't want your money." Ethan tilted his head. "That's the problem with you. You think this is about money." Alice swallowed hard. "Then what is it about?" Ethan took a step closer, his voice impossibly calm. "It's about control." She hated how that word sent a shiver down her spine. "I don't belong in your world," she said, her voice quieter now. Ethan studied her for a long moment. Then, almost too softly, he said, "And yet, here we are." Alice's heart slammed against her ribs. She should have slammed the door in his face. She should have told him to leave, but instead, she just stood there, trapped in the pull of a man she knew was dangerous. And deep down, she knew this was far from over. Before we start, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Alice barely slept that night. Ethan Duval had shown up at her doorstep, holding her eviction notice like it was a chess piece in some twisted game. And the worst part? She didn't know if he was offering her a way out or backing her into a corner. Either way, she refused to let him win. The next morning, she threw herself into work, trying to drown out the gnawing anxiety in her gut. The Maplewood Diner was a place of routine, of predictable chaos, and she clung to that familiarity like a lifeline. But even here, she couldn't escape him. "You've been staring at the coffee pot for 10 minutes, Camilla said, snapping her gun. "You planning on falling in?" Alice shook herself out of her thoughts. "Just thinking," Camilla smirked. "Let me guess. Tall, dark, and loaded?" Alice shot her a look. "I'm not thinking about him." "Liar," Alice groaned, grabbing a coffee cup and filling it to the brim. "He's infuriating." Camilla leaned on the counter. "And hot. Don't forget hot." Alice glared at her. "Not the point." Camilla just grinned. "Look, all I'm saying is, the guy shows up at your door like some brooding billionaire anti-hero, practically hands you a way out of your problems and you... What? Slap it back in his face?" Alice clenched her jaw. "I don't need his charity," Camilla sighed. "Babe, you're about to get kicked out of your apartment. I'll figure something out. Like, what? Selling a kidney?" Alice shot her a look. Camilla held up her hands. Okay. I'm just saying, maybe this isn't the worst thing in the world." Alice didn't answer. Because deep down, in the part of her she didn't want to acknowledge, she knew Camilla wasn't entirely wrong. Ethan sat in his office, staring out at the New York skyline, fingers tapping against his desk. Alice Moretti was proving to be more of a challenge than he anticipated. Most people took his deals without hesitation. They saw the money, the power, and they bent to it. But Alice? She pushed back, and for reasons he couldn't quite explain, that fascinated him. "Sir?" Ethan turned to see his assistant Daniel standing at the door. "She hasn't called," Daniel said. Ethan smirked. "She will." Daniel hesitated. "And if she doesn't?" Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Then I'll have to give her a reason to." Alice. Ethan knew she was running out of time. Every solution she thought of, extra shifts, selling some of her artwork, even taking out a loan, wasn't enough. She had 2 weeks before she was out on the street, and no miracle was coming to save her. And then, as if the universe was mocking her, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She debated ignoring it, but something told her she already knew who it was. With a sigh, she answered. "What do you want, Ethan?" Silence. Then, "Meet me for dinner." Alice let out a humorless laugh. "You don't give up, do you?" "I don't make offers twice, Alice," Ethan said, smoothly. "This is your last chance." Alice gritted her teeth. She hated him, hated his arrogance, hated the way he always seemed 10 steps ahead. But she hated feeling powerless even more. "Fine," she said, gripping the phone. "One dinner, and then you leave me alone." She could practically hear his smirk through the phone. 7 o'clock. Don't be late." Alice stood outside the restaurant, heart pounding. This was a mistake, but she was already here. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. And the moment her eyes met Ethan's across the room, she knew she had just walked into something she wasn't sure she could walk out of. Alice had walked into a battlefield. She knew that the moment she stepped into the lavish restaurant and locked eyes with Ethan Duval, he was already seated at a private table near the window, a glass of whiskey in his hand, looking like he owned not just the restaurant, but the entire city. He wore control like a second skin, composed, calculating, completely unaffected. Meanwhile, Alice felt like she had walked in wearing a flashing neon sign that read, "Out of place." She took a steadying breath and walked toward him, keeping her chin high. She wouldn't let him see her nerves. Ethan watched her approach, his expression unreadable. As she reached the table, he stood, because of course, he was the kind of man who still had old money manners. "Alice," His voice was smooth, effortless. She slid into the chair across from him. Ethan. A waiter appeared instantly, pouring wine into crystal glasses before disappearing again. Alice ignored it. Let's skip the pleasantries. Why am I here? Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying her like she was a puzzle he was enjoying putting together. Because you finally realized you're running out of options. Alice's fingers curled around her napkin. And what if I say no again? Ethan tilted his head. Then you lose your apartment. The bluntness of it sent a spark of irritation through her veins. So, that's your plan? Trap me into saying yes? Ethan took a sip of his whiskey before answering. I don't trap people, Alice. I offer them choices. Alice let out a sharp laugh. Right. Marry a billionaire or live on the street. Some choice. Ethan set his glass down, his gaze steady. I don't expect you to marry me. Just play the part. Public appearances. Events. A few months, and then you walk away. Better off than you were before. Alice stared at him, searching for cracks in his composure. Why me? Ethan didn't blink. Because you're unexpected. Alice exhaled slowly. I don't trust you. Ethan smirked. Good. You shouldn't. Their eyes locked, and for a moment, something passed between them. Something neither of them wanted to name. Alice broke the stare first, shaking her head. I should go. But just as she reached for her bag, a voice interrupted. Ethan? Alice turned and felt her stomach drop. A woman stood by their table, elegant in a deep red dress, her dark eyes narrowing as they landed on Alice. Ethan's expression remained cool, but something in his shoulders tensed. Charlotte, he said smoothly. Alice felt the shift in the air instantly. Whoever this woman was, she wasn't just some random acquaintance. Charlotte's eyes flicked between them, sharp with unspoken questions. Then, after a long, tense pause, she smiled, faint and unreadable. I didn't realize you were involved with someone, she said lightly, though her tone was anything but casual. Ethan didn't hesitate. We haven't announced it yet. Alice's breath caught. What? Charlotte's gaze landed on her again, this time with a hint of amusement. Interesting choice. Alice clenched her jaw. She didn't know who this woman was, but she was already getting under her skin. Ethan, ever composed, simply nodded. We should catch up sometime, Charlotte, but not tonight. It was a dismissal. Charlotte took the hint. Of course, she said, though her eyes lingered on Alice for just a moment longer before she turned and walked away. Alice watched her go, her mind racing. The second Charlotte was out of earshot, she turned to Ethan. Who was that? Ethan took another sip of his whiskey. My grandfather's first choice. Alice's stomach twisted. You mean the woman I was supposed to marry? Ethan finished. Silence. Alice swallowed. And now? Ethan's gaze was unreadable. Now he'll have to get used to his second choice. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She had thought she had the upper hand in this conversation. But suddenly, it felt like Ethan Duvall had been playing her from the very beginning. And worse, she wasn't sure she wanted to walk away anymore. Join us on this journey. Before we start, share your location in the comments and enjoy the experience. Alice wasn't sure how the hell she had ended up here. One moment, she had been sitting across from Ethan Duvall in a high-end restaurant, trying to ignore the way his ex-almost fiancé had looked at her like she was nothing more than a passing inconvenience. The next, she was standing in the pouring rain outside his sleek black car, arms crossed, glaring at him like she could somehow will him out of existence. Get in the car, Alice. Ethan's voice was calm, controlled, like he was used to. Getting his way. Alice scoffed. Not a chance. Ethan exhaled, tilting his head slightly. It's raining. I noticed. She wiped a wet strand of hair out of her face. And I'd rather walk home than owe you another favor. Ethan studied her for a moment, then shrugged. Fine. Enjoy pneumonia. He turned, moved to step into the car, and then a crack of thunder rumbled overhead. Alice flinched. She hated thunderstorms. Always had. Ethan must have noticed because instead of getting into the car, he let out a slow breath, then stepped closer, his voice quieter now. Alice. She didn't move, didn't blink, didn't let him see the way her pulse spiked at the way he said her name. "Get in the car," he repeated, and this time, it wasn't a command. It was something else, something close to a plea. Alice exhaled sharply, weighing her pride against the fact that her clothes were already soaked, and her apartment was a very long walk away. Finally, with a frustrated groan, she yanked the passenger door open and slid inside. The second she shut the door, the warmth of the car wrapped around her, contrasting sharply with the cold rain outside. Ethan didn't say anything at first. He simply pulled onto the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel with a quiet sort of confidence. Alice stared out the window, trying to ignore the way her heart was still racing. "This doesn't change anything," she muttered after a long silence. Ethan smirked. "Of course not." Alice gritted her teeth. "I mean it." Ethan's hands flexed around the wheel. "So do I." Another stretch of silence. Then, "Who is Charlotte, really?" Alice asked, turning to face him. Ethan didn't flinch. "I told you. My grandfather's choice." Alice narrowed her eyes. "And why didn't you marry her?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because I don't take orders." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Alice studied him carefully, searching for cracks in the perfect, untouchable surface he presented to the world. "Then why are you taking orders now?" she asked softly. Ethan let out a slow breath, low. "Because, for once, I see an opportunity." Alice frowned. "An opportunity for what?" Ethan pulled the car to a stop in front of her apartment. Then he turned to face her fully. "An opportunity to change the game." Alice's throat went dry. She didn't know what he meant, didn't know if she wanted to. But before she could respond, Ethan reached into the center console, pulled out a small velvet box, and placed it between them. Alice stared at it like it was a bomb. "What is that?" Ethan leaned back against the seat, watching her carefully. "It's a ring." Alice blinked. "I gathered that much." "Genius. Why do you have it?" Ethan's lips quirked slightly. "Because I don't lose, Alice." Her stomach twisted. "Are you saying—" "I don't want to marry Charlotte," Ethan interrupted smoothly. "And I don't want to let my grandfather dictate my life. That leaves me with one option." Alice swallowed. Hard. "And that option is— me?" Ethan tilted his head. "Why not?" She let out a breathless laugh. "You cannot be serious." Ethan studied her, his expression unreadable. "I don't do things I'm not serious about." Alice's fingers curled into fists. "You think I'm going to marry you because you don't want to deal with your family's drama?" Ethan didn't blink. "I think you're going to pretend to marry me because, right now, you need me just as much as I need you." Alice's chest tightened. She wanted to throw the ring out the window, wanted to slap him for even suggesting something so insane. But the truth was, he wasn't wrong. She did need him, and she hated that more than anything. "You don't play fair," she muttered. Ethan's smirk deepened. "I never said I did." Alice inhaled sharply, staring at the ring box between them. She had a choice to make, a dangerous, life-altering choice. Deep down, she already knew what her answer would be. Alice never thought she'd be the kind of person who had to fake a marriage. But then again, she never thought she'd meet someone like Ethan Duvall. She spent the next 2 days avoiding his calls, pacing her apartment, and trying to convince herself that there had to be another way. Any other way, and yet her eviction notice sat on the counter, a ticking time bomb. She hated that Ethan was right. She hated that she was even considering this insanity. But just as she was about to call Camilla for advice, her phone rang. She frowned. Unknown number. For a brief moment, she thought it was Ethan. She was wrong. The voice on the other end was panicked. "Is this Alice Moretti?" Alice sat up straighter. "Who's asking?" "It's about Ethan Duvall." Her breath caught. "What happened?" There was a pause. Then, in a voice that sent ice through her veins, "There's been an accident." Alice barely remembered how she got there. One moment, she was in her apartment. The next, she was pushing through the automatic doors of Lenox Hill Hospital, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She had no idea why she was running to him. No idea why the thought of something happening to Ethan made her stomach twist. But none of it mattered when she saw Daniel, Ethan's assistant, standing in the waiting room, his normally polished appearance disheveled. Alice stopped in front of him, breathless. "Where is he?" Daniel looked up, surprised to see her. He hesitated. "He's in surgery." Alice's knees nearly buckled. Surgery. That word rang in her ears, drowning out everything else. "What happened?" she demanded. Daniel hesitated. His brother and sister-in-law. There was a car accident. Alice's stomach plummeted. Daniel swallowed hard. Ethan was called to the scene. By the time he got there, it was too late. They didn't make it. Alice's hands shook. She barely knew Ethan's family, but she knew loss. She knew the kind of grief that hollowed you out, left you aching. Daniel continued. He was driving back when another car ran a red light. He swerved to avoid it, crashed into a barrier. He's lucky to be alive. Alice's heart twisted painfully. Ethan Duval. The untouchable, unshakable man who always had control. Now lying on an operating table, powerless. Alice pressed a hand to her chest, trying to breathe. And her voice broke. His brother had kids, didn't he? Daniel nodded, his expression grim. 2. A boy and a girl. They're upstairs with the family lawyer now. Alice squeezed her eyes shut. This wasn't just Ethan's tragedy. This was 2 children losing everything. And when she opened her eyes, she knew. This wasn't about a contract anymore. This was about him. Ethan Duval had just lost everything. And whether she liked it or not, she wasn't going anywhere. Before we start, share your location in the comments and enjoy the experience. Let's dive in. The smell of antiseptic filled Alice's nose as she sat in the cold, sterile waiting room of Lenox Hill Hospital. She hadn't moved in hours. She couldn't. Not when Ethan Duval was lying unconscious just a few floors away. Not when 2 orphaned children were sitting in a separate room, waiting for someone to tell them what came next. Not when everything had changed. Alice hadn't planned on staying. After Daniel had told her about the accident, she had thought about walking away. Ethan wasn't her responsibility. This wasn't her world. And yet here she was. Because no matter how much she wanted to pretend otherwise, she couldn't ignore the way her heart had nearly stopped when she heard his name and the word surgery in the same sentence. She couldn't ignore the fact that, despite everything, she cared. And that scared her more than anything. The sound of approaching footsteps snapped Alice from her thoughts. She looked up just as Daniel appeared, his usually composed face strained. "He's awake," he said. Alice exhaled, her grip on the chair loosening slightly. "How bad?" she asked. Daniel hesitated. "A concussion. 2 fractured ribs. Nothing life-threatening." Alice nodded slowly, relief flooding through her veins. But Daniel's expression didn't soften. "There's a problem," he said. Alice frowned. "What kind of problem?" Daniel glanced toward the hallway, lowering his voice. "The children," he murmured. "Social services is involved." Alice's stomach dropped. "Because Ethan is their next of kin?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "And because his grandfather is pushing for custody." Alice stilled. She had never met Charles Duval, but she had heard enough about him to know he was dangerous in his own way. A man who saw people as assets, not family. Alice swallowed. "And Ethan?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "He refuses to let Charles take them." Alice's pulse quickened. "Can he stop it?" she asked. Daniel hesitated. "Not unless he can prove he's stable," he said carefully. "That he has a family environment to offer." Alice stared at him, the weight of those words settling hard. She knew what Daniel wasn't saying, knew what he was implying. Ethan couldn't fight this battle alone. He needed an advantage. He needed her. Alice didn't remember walking to his room, didn't remember pushing open the heavy door or stepping inside. But suddenly, she was there, and so was he. Ethan was propped up against the hospital bed, his face pale, his usually flawless suit replaced by a hospital gown. But his eyes, those impossibly sharp blue eyes, were the same. And the second they landed on her, something flickered behind them. Surprise, relief, a vulnerability she had never seen before. Alice swallowed hard, stepping closer. "You're awake," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. Ethan's lips twitched. "That makes 2 of us." The joke was dry, but Alice didn't miss. the exhaustion in his voice. She hesitated. I heard about your brother." Ethan's jaw tensed, but he didn't look away. "I'm sorry," Alice said softly. A beat of silence. Then Ethan exhaled, looking away. "I don't need sympathy." Alice studied him, the way his hands curled slightly into fists against the blanket, the way his throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, the way his shoulders, usually squared and proud, now looked heavy, like the weight of the world had finally settled on them. "You need help," Alice said quietly. Ethan's eyes snapped back to hers, and in them, she saw something raw, something desperate. "Don't," he said. "Don't offer something you're not ready to give." Alice's heart pounded, because she knew. She knew what he was asking, knew that once she stepped into this, there was no going back. She took a deep breath, ignoring every instinct that screamed at her to run. Then, she sat down, met his gaze, and said the three words that changed everything. "I'll do it." Before we start, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Enjoy the experience. Alice had just made the biggest mistake of her life, or maybe the most reckless decision she'd ever made. Either way, there was no turning back, because now she wasn't just playing along with Ethan Duvall's twisted little game. She was part of it. "You're sure about this?" Daniel's voice was cautious as he handed Alice a folder. Another contract note. She ignored it. "Would it matter if I wasn't?" she asked dryly. Daniel sighed. "Ethan doesn't make deals he doesn't intend to collect on." Alice's stomach twisted, but she nodded. She had known that the second she opened her mouth in that hospital room. The next morning, Alice found herself standing outside a mansion. Correction, a fortress disguised as a home. It loomed over her, all sleek glass and steel, perched on the upper east side like something out of a billionaire's fever dream. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered. Ethan's estate wasn't just luxurious, it was ridiculous. She had seen hotels with less square footage, and now she was expected to live here? The door swung open before she could second-guess herself. Ethan stood there, still looking like he belonged on the cover of a financial magazine, his suit crisp, his expression unreadable. "You're late," he said. Alice scoffed. "I was debating running." Ethan smirked. "And yet, here you are." Her jaw tightened. "Not because of you." For the briefest second, something flickered in his eyes, something darker. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. He stepped aside. "Come inside." Alice hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, she crossed the threshold. And just like that, she wasn't just in his world anymore. She was trapped in it. The children were the first thing Alice noticed. A boy, maybe 7 or 8, stood stiffly by the staircase, his tiny hands clenched into fists. Beside him, a younger girl, 4, maybe 5, clutched a stuffed rabbit to her chest, her wide brown eyes peeking out from behind him. Alice's heart squeezed. They were just kids. Alone. Frightened. Stuck in a life that had been rewritten overnight. And God help her, she understood exactly how that felt. "Madeline Oliver," Ethan said, his voice gentler than she'd ever heard it. "This is Alice." The little girl, Madeline, ducked her head. The boy, Oliver, didn't blink. "Is she your wife?" he asked flatly. Alice nearly choked. Ethan, of course, didn't flinch. "She will be," he said smoothly. Oliver frowned. "I don't believe you." Alice let out a breathless laugh. "Smart kid." Ethan shot her a warning look, but Oliver wasn't done. "You don't like him," the boy accused. Alice paused. Then, slowly, she knelt to Oliver's level, meeting his sharp, skeptical gaze. "You don't like him either," she pointed out. Oliver narrowed his eyes. "No." Alice grinned. "Good. Then we're in this together." For the first time, something shifted. Oliver studied her. Then, finally, nodded. And just like that, Alice had her first ally in this house. Later that night, Alice collapsed onto the absurdly large bed in the guest room, staring at the ceiling. She was exhausted. Between moving into a house that felt like a museum, trying to connect with 2 grieving kids, and pretending to be Ethan's fiancée, her brain felt like it had been thrown in a blender, And the worst part? Ethan hadn't been around all day. She had no idea where he'd gone, only that he had left her alone to deal with everything. Typical. She was so close to falling asleep when a knock echoed against the door. She groaned. "If this is about a contract, I swear to God." The door opened. It wasn't Daniel. It wasn't the kids. It was Ethan. And he didn't look like the man who had walked out of the hospital hours ago. He looked wrecked. Alice sat up, her exhaustion forgotten. "Ethan." He didn't respond at first, just stood there, silent. Then, "Why did you say yes?" His voice was rough, barely above a whisper. Alice swallowed. "You needed help," she admitted. Ethan's jaw tightened. "That's not why." Alice's stomach twisted. Because he was right. That wasn't all of it, and she wasn't ready to admit why yet. So instead, she just held his gaze. And for the first time since they'd met, Ethan Duvall looked away first. Before we begin, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Enjoy the journey. Alice wasn't sure what she expected Ethan to say, but she definitely didn't expect him to look lost. Ethan Duvall didn't do lost. He was always in control, always 10 steps ahead. But standing in the doorway of her room, his shoulders tense, his expression guarded, he looked like a man who had been wrecked from the inside out. Alice's stomach twisted. She shouldn't care. She really, really shouldn't. But she did. And that was a problem. Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I wasn't supposed to need anyone," he muttered. Alice frowned. "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard." Ethan's lips twitched, just slightly. "You say that a lot. Because you say a lot of dumb things." A beat of silence. Then, "Why are you really here, Ethan?" Alice asked quietly. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Because I keep waiting for this to make sense. And it doesn't." Alice swallowed. "What doesn't?" His eyes locked onto hers. "You." Her breath caught. Ethan shook his head, almost as if he were frustrated. "I don't get it. You push back. You don't let me win. And now, you're here, helping. Even when you don't have to." Alice hesitated. Then, carefully, she said, "Maybe I know what it's like to lose people too." The words hung between them. Ethan stilled. His gaze, usually so unreadable, shifted. "Your parents?" he asked quietly. Alice exhaled slowly. "My mom. Cancer. My dad left before I was old enough to remember him." Ethan was silent. Alice bit her lip. "I spent a long time feeling like the world owed me something for taking her away." She let out a humorless laugh. "Turns out the world doesn't care." Ethan's fingers curled at his sides. Alice tilted her head. "And you?" Ethan hesitated. Then, finally, "My parents died when I was 16. Alice's heart clenched. Ethan never talked about himself. Never let anyone see the cracks beneath the surface. But tonight, he was letting her in. Alice swallowed. "How?" Ethan's gaze flickered. "Plane crash." She winced. "God, Ethan. Don't," he said smoothly. "I don't need pity." Alice sighed. "I wasn't offering." A beat of silence. Then, Ethan let out a slow breath. "My grandfather took control of everything after that," he admitted. "Told me grief was a weakness, that I needed to focus on the company, instead of wasting time feeling sorry for myself." Alice flinched. Because suddenly, everything about Ethan Duvall made sense. The control, the calculated choices, the refusal to let anyone close. He had spent his whole life making sure no one could hurt him again. Alice's chest ached. She reached out, just slightly, then hesitated. But before she could pull away, Ethan did something that stunned her. He closed the distance, his fingers curled around her wrist, gentle but firm. And for the first time since they met, he let his walls down. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice raw. Alice's heart pounded. "Do what?" she whispered. Ethan's eyes darkened. "Feel something I can't control." A shiver ran down Alice's spine. Because this wasn't just about the kids, or the contract, or the arrangement they had made. This was about them. Alice exhaled slowly. "You don't have to." Control everything, Ethan. He let out a bitter laugh. That's where you're wrong. Alice shook her head. No, I'm not. Ethan studied her, long, hard. Then, without thinking, without planning, Alice leaned forward and kissed him. It wasn't soft, it wasn't careful, it was fire. And this time, Ethan, and this time, didn't pull away. Before we start, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Enjoy the experience. Alice wasn't sure who moved first. Maybe it was her, closing the last inches between them. Maybe it was Ethan, his grip tightening just before his mouth claimed hers. All she knew was that 1 second, they were teetering on the edge, and the next, they were falling. The kiss was nothing like she expected. Ethan Duval was always in control, always calculated, always 2 steps ahead. But this was raw. His hand slid into her hair, fingers curling at the nape of her neck. His lips pressed hungrily against hers, like he had been waiting for this moment longer than he wanted to admit. Alice gasped against his mouth, gripping his shirt to keep herself steady. She had kissed men before, but she had never been kissed like this. Like she was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. Like he needed her. And that thought terrified her, because deep down, she needed him too. Ethan was the first to pull away, barely. His forehead rested against hers, his breath coming in uneven. Alice's chest rose and fell in time with his. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them moved. Then, Ethan's fingers traced a slow, dangerous path along her jaw. This wasn't supposed to happen, he murmured. Alice swallowed. I know. Ethan exhaled, tilting her chin up gently, almost like he was memorizing her. But now that it has, he said, his voice low, gravelly, dangerous. I don't think I can stop. Alice's heart skipped, because the way he said it, like it wasn't a choice, like she had just become his new obsession. The next morning, Alice woke up alone. Her mind was still spinning. She wasn't sure if last night had been a mistake, but she was sure of one thing. Ethan Duval was dangerous, not because of his money, not because of his power, but because of the way he made her feel seen, the way he made her feel like she wasn't just some passing distraction, but something he couldn't afford to lose. And that was the most dangerous thing of all, because Ethan Duval didn't lose, ever. Before we start, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Enjoy the experience. Alice had never been this confused in her life. The night before, she had kissed Ethan Duval. Or maybe he had kissed her. Either way, it had happened. And now, she was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince herself it didn't mean anything, that she could just pretend it hadn't changed everything. But the problem was, it had. Because Ethan wasn't just the man who had offered her a deal anymore. He was the man who had touched her like he was afraid to break her. The man who had kissed her like he was starving for something he couldn't name. The man who, despite everything, was starting to matter. And that scared her more than anything. Alice barely made it downstairs before reality slammed into her. Because standing in the middle of the massive sunlit living room was Charlotte. Looking perfect, looking smug, looking like she still belonged in Ethan's world. Alice's stomach dropped. "What are you doing here?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. Charlotte smirked. "Checking in on an old friend?" Alice clenched her jaw. "Right." Charlotte tilted her head, studying her with thinly veiled amusement. "You know, I wasn't sure if this arrangement of yours was real, but now that I see you up close, I get it." Alice folded her arms. "Get what?" Charlotte's lips curled. "You're his rebellion," she said simply. Alice stiffened. "You think he chose you because he loves you?" Charlotte continued, her voice mocking. "Please. Ethan doesn't love Alice. He plays." Alice's chest tightened. She wouldn't let Charlotte get to her. But then, Charlotte sighed dramatically, pulling a folded piece of paper from her purse. "You should really be careful what you sign, sweetheart." Alice frowned. "What?" And then she saw it. The contract. The one she had barely glanced at before agreeing to help Ethan. Only now, there was a new clause, a new price. Alice felt her blood run cold. Because there, in crisp black ink, was a termination payout. A sum of money that Ethan would pay her to leave, to disappear, to walk away after the arrangement was over. Alice's hands shook. She had trusted him, had started to think for just a moment that maybe, she was more than just another business deal. And now, she had proof that she was wrong. Charlotte smiled, triumphant. "Welcome to the real world, Alice." Alice barely heard her, because suddenly all she could think about was getting out. Alice found Ethan in his office, leaning over his desk, speaking into his phone. He barely looked up when she walked in. "Alice..." She threw the contract onto his desk. Ethan's brows furrowed. "What? Tell me it's not true," she said, her voice shaking. Ethan's expression hardened the second his eyes landed on the paper. His silence was answer enough. Alice let out a hollow laugh. "Wow." Ethan straightened, calm. Too calm. "Where did you get this? Does it matter?" Alice snapped. "I signed up to help you, Ethan. To keep those kids from ending up with your cold-hearted grandfather." Ethan's jaw tightened. "And you have. But this was always the plan, Alice." Alice's chest ached. "Then why the hell did you kiss me?" Ethan stilled. For the first time, he looked caught off guard. Alice exhaled sharply. "You know what? It doesn't matter." She shook her head. "Because I'm done." Ethan's eyes darkened. "Alice..." "No." Her voice cracked. "You made it very clear what I mean to you. And now I'm making it clear what you mean to me." She turned to leave. "But then..." Ethan's voice, low and lethal. "You walk out that door, and you prove me right." Alice froze. Ethan's words wrapped around her like a vice. Slow, controlled, deadly. "Because that's what people do, isn't it?" he murmured. "They leave." Alice's breath hitched, and for the first time, she saw. It. The real reason Ethan never let anyone get close. The reason he chose her in the first place. Because Ethan Duvall didn't just expect betrayal. He was waiting for it. Alice swallowed hard. She should have said something. Should have stayed. But instead, she walked out. And this time, she didn't look back. Before we begin, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Enjoy the experience. Alice barely felt the cold February air as she stepped out of Ethan Duvall's mansion. Her heart was pounding, her pulse roaring in her ears. She had spent weeks in that house. Weeks, thinking, stupidly, recklessly thinking, that maybe, just maybe, Ethan had started to see her as more than a contract, more than a bargain. But she had been wrong, and she had proof. That piece of paper, that damn contract, was all the evidence she needed, because Ethan Duvall had planned for her to leave from the start. And the worst part? The worst, most humiliating part? Somewhere along the way, she had convinced herself she wanted to stay. Alice didn't know where she was going. She just walked. Block after block, the Manhattan skyline blurred past her, neon lights reflecting off wet pavement. She could have called Camilla, could have gone to a friend's place. But instead, she ended up in front of the one thing she had been avoiding for weeks, her apartment building. It was still hers, technically, for a few more days, until the eviction notice kicked in. Alice let out a hollow laugh. Funny. She had walked away from millions, and now she was about to lose the only thing she actually owned. With a sigh, she climbed the stairs, unlocking the door to her tiny, empty apartment. The air inside was stale, like the place had been waiting for her to come back. For a brief moment, she hesitated in the doorway. Then slowly, she stepped inside. And just like that, her life before Ethan Duvall came crashing back. Ethan wasn't angry. Anger would have been easier. Anger was clean. Anger meant control. But what Ethan felt when Alice walked out that door, it wasn't anger. It was chaos. He stood in his office, staring at the shredded contract on his desk. The proof that she had seen it. That Charlotte had shown her. That Alice hadn't believed in him at all. His hands curled into fists. Because, deep down, he knew. He had let her believe it. Had let his pride, his stupid fear of vulnerability, turn him into exactly what she thought he was. A cold, heartless bastard. And now she was gone. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Duvall wasn't sure if he knew how to fix it. Alice spent the next 3 days trying to pretend she was fine. She wasn't. But she went through the motions anyway, packed up her apartment, boxed up the pieces of her old life, tried not to think about him, tried not to remember the way he had kissed her like he needed her, like she was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. But then, the universe as always had other plans, because on the 4th day, as she was dragging the last of her boxes down the stairs, a sleek black car pulled up in front of the building. Alice's stomach dropped. The driver stepped out, walked around to the back door, and then Ethan Duvall stepped out, dressed in a charcoal gray coat, hands in his pockets, expression impossible to read. Alice's heart slammed against her ribs. She shouldn't have been surprised. Ethan wasn't the kind of man who let things go easily. But still, she hadn't expected him to come after her. And now? Now, she had no idea if she wanted to run or let him catch her. Before we start, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Enjoy the experience. Alice's hands tightened around the box she was holding, because standing in front of her, on the worst possible day, was Ethan Duvall. Tall, composed, impossibly calm, like he hadn't shattered her. Trust just days ago. Alice's pulse pounded. She should have slammed the apartment door in his face. She should have told him to leave. But instead, she stared. Because for the first time, Ethan Duvall looked different. Not cold, not calculating, just tired, just human. And that scared her more than anything. Ethan took a slow step forward. "Alice," he said. Her breath hitched. She hated how her name sounded in his voice, hated how it made something deep inside her ache. She swallowed hard. "What are you doing here?" Ethan's gaze searched hers. "I was wrong," he said simply. Alice froze. Because Ethan Duvall didn't apologize, didn't admit fault. And yet, here he was, raw, unfiltered, saying the one thing she never thought she'd hear. Alice's throat tightened. "You planned for me to leave," she whispered. "From the beginning." "No," he cut in. "I planned to keep myself from needing you." Her breath caught. Ethan let out a slow, controlled exhale. "I don't trust easily. I don't let people in. And when I met you, I told myself I wouldn't make that mistake." Alice's chest ached, because this was the first time he was saying it out loud. The first time he was telling her what she had already known. That Ethan Duvall was terrified of losing control, and she was the only person who had ever made him lose it. Alice swallowed hard. "And now?" she whispered. Ethan took another step closer. "Now I don't care about control," he murmured. "I just care about you." Alice's heart stopped. The city moved around them. People passed. Cars honked. Life went on. But Alice and Ethan? They stood frozen in the middle of it all. A slow, steady storm threatening to consume them both. Alice exhaled shakily. "How do I know you won't push me away again?" she whispered. Ethan's jaw tightened. "You don't," he admitted. "But I'll spend every day proving that I won't." Alice's eyes burned. Because this was the man she had seen beneath the armor. Not the billionaire, not the cold strategist, but the man who had lost everything and was terrified of losing her too. Alice let out a slow, uneven breath. Then, finally, she let the box in her hands fall to the ground. Ethan didn't hesitate. He closed the distance, his hands cradling her face, his forehead pressing against hers. And for the first time, there was no contract, no rules, no calculations, just them. Two people who had spent their whole lives afraid of love, finally falling into it. Before we start, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Enjoy the experience. Alice had always believed that love was messy, that it was complicated, unpredictable, something that came with heartbreak as much as happiness. But standing there, forehead pressed to Ethan's, hands curled into his coat, she realized something else. Love wasn't just messy, it was terrifying. Because letting someone in meant giving them the power to hurt you. And Ethan Duvall? He could destroy her. But instead of pushing away, she did something even riskier. She let him stay. Ethan pulled back slightly, his hands still warm against her skin. "I need to show you something," he said. Alice swallowed. "Ethan, trust me." His voice was steady, certain. And despite everything, she did. 15 minutes later, Alice was standing in front of a building she knew too well. She stiffened. "Ethan," she whispered, "the lease is in your name," he said, cutting her off. Alice's heart slammed against her ribs. She turned slowly. "You paid off your eviction," Ethan finished. "Bought the building, actually." Alice's breath hitched. Not because of the money, not because of the insane gesture, but because of what it meant. Ethan Duval, the man who had spent his life controlling everything, had given her back her home, without conditions, without contracts, just because he wanted to. Alice blinked rapidly. Ethan, I didn't ask for this." Ethan's gaze softened. I know." Alice's throat tightened. "You're not buying me," she whispered. "I know," Ethan repeated. "But I couldn't let you walk away thinking I never chose you." Alice froze. Because those words, they were everything she had needed to hear. Not that he needed her, not that he was obsessed with her, but that he had chosen her, again and again and again. Alice let out a shaky breath. "You infuriate me," she murmured. Ethan smirked. Likewise. A beat of silence. Then, Alice launched herself into his arms. And Ethan caught her like he had been waiting to do it forever. Before we start, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Enjoy the final chapter. Alice Moretti never believed in perfect ending, but standing there, wrapped in Ethan's arms, her forehead pressed against his, she realized something else. Maybe she didn't need perfect. Maybe she just needed this. Him. Them. Messy, complicated, real. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of it. A week later, Alice was back at the Maplewood Diner. Only this time, she wasn't working. She was sitting in a booth, stirring her coffee, trying to ignore the fact that Ethan Duval was sitting across from her like he belonged there. He didn't. And yet, here he was. In a tailored suit, sipping terrible diner coffee, completely unbothered by the fact that the entire restaurant was staring at him. Alice sighed. "You know, normal people don't wear $5,000 suits to breakfast." Ethan smirked. "I don't do normal." Alice rolled her eyes. "Yeah, I noticed." Ethan just watched her, a quiet sort of amusement flickering in his eyes. "You're really staying?" Alice asked, voice softer now. Ethan's smirk faded slightly. "Are you?" Alice swallowed. Because this was it. The moment where she could still walk away. Still pretend this hadn't changed her. Still pretend that Ethan Duval wasn't already in her bones. But the truth was, she didn't want to run anymore. She didn't want to fight this. So instead, she reached across the table, lacing her fingers through his. And Ethan, for the first time, he let her hold him. No contracts, no deals, just them. Messy, imperfect, real, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The end. Thank you for being part of this journey. Drop a comment below and let us know what you thought of the story. Would you have made the same choices as Alice? Let's discuss.